Well, this forum, I think, comes at an exciting time. Educators now, I think, are grappling with how to transform schools, particularly in low-income communities, often communities of color, into vibrant centers of learning. And I think they're realizing that they can't do it alone. And rather than blaming families and focusing on community problems, I think many educators now are starting to see families and communities as assets, as powerful and positive change agents in schools and communities. So we have educators who I think are interested in this. On the community end, I think if you had looked 20 years ago, you'd probably be hard-pressed to find a community organizing group that was working actively around education. Now I think it's at the top of many organizing groups' agenda. And in fact, I think organizing has emerged as a very powerful force for improving schools in low-income communities in a variety of ways. Groups are experimenting with ways to contribute to school improvement in schools, to create the political will for change, and to hold schools accountable to organized constituencies. So we have organizers interested in this. And finally, I think researchers and scholars are starting to take organizing seriously as an authentic expression of community will, and reinvigorating the long American tradition of recognizing education as central to the democratic life of the country. Many scholars are trying to find ways to collaborate with organizing groups to advance the cause of education, democracy, and social justice. This forum is designed to try to bring together people from the organizing world, educators and researchers, to have a focused discussion about what organizing can contribute to school reform. And as I said, we have a conference coming up on the subject. And I don't think I can stress more the urgency of our agenda. I think many parents and leaders in low-income communities are frustrated with the slow pace of change that's happening in school systems. And I think organizing offers a chance to both push school systems to improve as well as to make concrete contributions to those efforts. We're fortunate tonight to have speakers who are leading thinkers and actors in this emerging field. We have two speakers tonight, Ernesto Cortez, Jr. from the Southwest Industrial Areas Foundation and Jeannie Oakes from UCLA. And we also have a respondent, Karen Mapp, who is going to offer some reflections on the presentations to help us open up the conversation. Let me first introduce Ernesto Cortez. As I said, he's the director of the Southwest Industrial Areas Foundation. And I think Ernie, as he's known, is considered one of the nation's leading organizers. He trained in the early 70s in Saul Alinsky's Industrial Areas Foundation Organizing Institute, and then returned to his hometown of San Antonio, where he organized a group called Communities Organized for Public Service, or COPS. Working with mostly Mexican-American Catholic parishes, COPS emerged as arguably the strongest community organization in the country. Ernie went on to help found multi-faith and multi-racial broad-based organizations across Texas and the Southwest, creating an active statewide network in Texas and an active regional network in the Southwest. In the late 80s, the IAF network in Texas became one of the first organizing groups to focus on education reform, and it built an alliance school network that today consists of 120 schools in Texas and more in other parts of the Southwest. I would say arguably the largest community-based effort to do school reform in the country. What's always interested me about Ernie's work is the effort not simply to have organizing groups pressure schools from the outside, but rather to experiment with taking the organizing process right into public schools as a strategy for institutional transformation, and at the same time to take schools out of themselves in a way through organizing to engage with broader community and public life of the city. Ernie's won lots of awards. He's now in LA, where he led the rebuilding of the IAF organization there. I've been fortunate to know Ernie for over 10 years and to both study his work and to learn from him. So let me say finally that Ernie's not just a consummate organizer, he's also known as an important thinker on education reform and democratic revitalization. So I hope you join me in welcoming Ernie Cortez.
May be a little distracted here, so let me see if I can do that. Okay, that's better. Okay. Well, I want to thank Mark Warren for those kind remarks, and I want to thank you for that warm welcome. And I hope that Mark didn't raise the expectations too high. I was trying to figure out who in the heck he was talking about after a while, but I finally figured since it was probably me. Notwithstanding the impressive nature of the other speakers who are going to be here today. I'd like to talk to you how I came at this business and how I think about this business from a bit of a personal and autobiographical sketch and narrative. I come at this work of organizing in schools from the perspective of an organizer with the Industrial Areas Foundation, but also from the perspective of a parent and a grandparent, which is something which I'm trying to get used to since my daughter gave birth to a very precious and beautiful son by the name of Joaquin, David. And so my three children all went to public schools. They graduated from public high schools in Austin, Texas. And all their lives they went to public schools. My daughter, Alma, is a teacher and a student at Bank Street, and she wants to be a professional educator in the best sense of the term. My other daughter, Amy, is an assistant principal at a low-income and was low-performing school in Austin. And my son, Jacob, is an organizer for SEIU, local. He's trying to build a union in Tucson, Arizona. And I asked him why he liked Tucson. And he said, "Dad, I don't like Tucson. I love Tucson." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, it reminds me of my childhood." Because at that time, before Jacob went to middle school, public, which is a public, he was going to a Montessori school, which has had some pretty flexible policies, and they allowed me to take him out of school quite a bit. So every time I went on a trip to Arizona, I took Jacob with me. And we went to, I don't know if you've ever, anybody here from Tucson or Pima County or Southern Arizona? Okay, well, you ever been to the Desert Museum? Okay, what's it like? It's gorgeous. It's fantastic. Okay, we went there about 7 or 8 times. Okay, and he loved that experience. And we went a lot of places all over Southern Arizona. One of the best places we went to was an inner city school run by Native Americans, for Native American kids. And Jacob got his first taste of what school reform was all about when he went to that school. And he contrasted the difference between that school and the schools that he had been to and seen in Austin. And he said, "Dad, they don't have a lot of stuff, okay? And they don't have much in terms of by way of books or materials, and the classes are big, and and they're quite behind." And he began to think with me a little bit about what was going on or not going on in those schools in Tucson, Arizona. Then as he went to public schools, we began to have further conversations about what he was doing, and I had further conversations with my children and my wife, whose specialty is bilingual children's literature, and trying to devise now in Los Angeles with libraries and schools construct a curriculum, which will enable parents, because she really believes that it's important that parents be involved. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I apologize. Okay, you should have said something earlier, Renee. Okay, well, you need to exercise some agency and some initiative, okay? Okay, thank you. I'm more worried about Robert Cordova. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, that's wonderful. Okay. All right. Well, so, all of this is to say that this whole business of school reform has kind of become a family affair, as well as something which I pursue as an organizer and as a citizen, and as somebody who cares deeply about the future of the country. Can you hear me? The gentleman in the
I'm listening to hear whether I'm raising the volume, so I'm trying to.
Okay, I just want to be sure. Okay, you look disturbed, okay, or troubled or something. Okay, all right. At any rate, and so therefore, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that, if you don't mind. First of all, let me just talk a little bit about what I do. Organizing for me is something very, very important, and it's particularly important now in the United States, where, from my perspective, the role of citizen, the role of neighbor, the role of people who care deeply about democratic institutions and Republican traditions is being minimized, marginalized, and to a certain extent scoffed at. We have, I don't want to be partisan here, but we have people in this country who don't seem to care much about traditions of law and respect for law. We have people in this country who don't seem to care much about the role of the whole tradition of checks and balance, the separations of powers, all the boundary questions and restraints that we have kind of always admired and revered in our country are under question now. And they're under question because we're all frightened. We're afraid. We're anxious. We're insecure, okay? And as a famous Englishman, whom I don't like much, once said, that there is this potential for what he called a state of nature. And during this state of nature, when civic institutions begin to collapse, people don't operate according to their interests. They operate or are mobilized according to their anxieties and their fears and their insecurities, and commerce becomes very difficult and life becomes nasty, brutish, and short. And he said some other things, too, which are interesting, but I can't remember all those things. And, of course, then he says, because we become so fearful of self-preservation, which is important, and we then are willing to kind of give up all of our liberties and all of our traditions and all of our interests, okay, to the one narrow focus of self-preservation. And there was an economist who wrote a book, we call it kind of the monkey book in the eye of culture because it has a picture of a chimpanzee on the front of it, which talks about the fact that genetically we are programmed to be shy, murderous apes, okay, who have this genetic inclination to regard anybody who is a stranger as an enemy and somebody to be maimed or worse, okay? And what keeps us from being this shy, murderous ape is our capacity to form symbol systems and habits and culture and attitudes, which we call, for lack of a better term, culture, civilization, okay, and all those things that come out of culture and civilization, okay, democratic values and et cetera, moral perspective. And all of that enables us, to get along with strangers. And the title of the book, of course, is A Company of Strangers. And I'm sure a lot of you have read the book or found the book quite interesting. Anybody here read the book? Okay. Well, then I can tell you what's in it, and you don't need to. I can make it up. Okay. All right. But anyway, as my favorite theologian Mario Moreno once said, and Jesus said, and if he didn't, he should have. Okay. Because what organizing is all about is developing the capacity of institutions and leaders to be able to act on their values and their vision. And the reason I want to go through this is because I want to make a distinction between organizing and mobilizing. Because a lot of people who do educational reform do very good mobilizations. They enable people to act on behalf of issues which are real important. They enable people to act on behalf of programs that are real important, enable people to act and teach people how to act on behalf of services which are real important, and all of that is necessary and important and part of organizing. But a more important dimension of organizing is identifying, testing out, and developing leaders, and developing those institutions, those intermediate institutions of family and congregation and labor union and school, and develop a network of institutions which enable character and culture and leadership and virtue to develop. Prosaically, the way I like to put it, is when I grew up in San Antonio, there was 200 adults who were organized against me. I'm sorry? Oh, okay. Okay, well, it's all right. Well, you could just say, look, one of my pastors, Father Dave O'Connell, likes to say he loves preaching in an African-American community, in a congregation. Because when he's hitting the right notes, they say, amen. Listen, can I get an amen from all of you, okay? I know this is Harvard, and I know you don't believe in that stuff. But anyway, just... But can I get an amen? All right, anyway. All right. But then when you get in trouble, they'll say, help him, Jesus, okay? Help him, Jesus, okay? Or help him, anyway, whatever you want to say. Allah, Buddha, whoever, okay. When I grew up, there was 200 adults who felt that they had responsibility for my life. And they shaped my perspective and my attitudes, okay? They shaped the way I thought about things, my relationships, my ability to form trust relationships, my ability to develop a narrative. All that came out of those overlapping networks of family and union and political party. My father would say, if you see a Republican, look but don't stare. Because we were all Democrats at that time and Catholics, okay? I'm going to be nonpartisan the rest of the evening, okay? Because unfortunately, as I've said to my friend David Gergen, or at least he misquoted me or quoted me, the Democratic Party represents people who make, between $150,000 a year and $300,000 a year, and the Republican Party represents people who make from $300,000 a year and up, but nobody represents the people that I care about. Okay, the people who tend to go to public schools. No one has their interest at heart. And so the part that we're up against in dealing with and organizing is beginning to think about how do we begin to get the attention and the recognition for the agenda that is important for people of low and moderate income means, because unfortunately public schools are one of the very few intermediate institutions that they have, besides the congregation. The unions are very, very weak right now, and I applaud their efforts to begin to rebuild and to reorganize, but they're in the beginnings of that. The extended family is in trouble. The churches are becoming very, very weak and attenuated, okay? And so one of the few intermediate institutions that we have in the neighborhoods, in the communities, are public schools. But they tend to be run by downtown, by a very, very expert-driven, top-level bureaucracy, which really doesn't understand their role and their mission in terms of developing community, developing an understanding of trust, relationality, mutuality, all the things that are requisite if we're going to have any understanding of community citizenship and the values and vision of a democratic society. And that's very ironic, given the fact that everything I've read suggests that there's only one institution which has the responsibility to teach those values, those attitudes, those dispositions necessary for a democratic culture, and it is not the church, it is not the family, it's not the corporation, it's not the labor union. The only institution that the Supreme Court of the United States even suggests has that burden and that obligation is
Public schools.
okay. Can I get an amen for that? If you don't want to do amen, you can always do Crazy Horse's battle cry at the Little Big Horn. Come on, Lakota, today's a good day to die. Cowards to the rear, brave men to the front, okay? You don't like that? Okay, all right. I love that. Okay, anyway. But unfortunately, instead of thinking hard about how do we craft an institution which creates that kind of moral universe, that kind of understanding of what are the character and virtues and visions that are, and the storyline, the narrative that we all need to have, which is shared, to be sure, in conflict, okay, because the narrative reflects an ambiguous legacy of slavery and racism and a little bit of imperialism. Not a whole lot, but a little bit, okay? Every once in a while, okay? At least in the Southwest we saw that, okay? You probably didn't see it anywhere else, okay? Okay. And we had to fight an incredible bloody civil war in order to get recognition that all of us have certain basic rights and obligations and attitudes, okay? That all of us have the right to be persons. The Greek word for person means someone who stands open to the other. The Greek word for person means someone who wears a mask, can be part of public life, and be a persona in that public life, and by so doing can begin to engage in dialogue and disposition and arguments which enable a democratic culture to emerge. through politics, through the political. Not the contestation for power and resources, but that kind of political furtive events which enables people to come together and have an understanding of the common good and how that we are collectively involved in a journey and in a struggle. Now that does not happen by wishing for it, by wanting it. It happens through contestation, through deliberation, through conflict, through tension, through negotiations. But those skills require cultivation. Those skills, attitudes require development. They require teaching. They require education in the best sense of the word, the Latin word meaning, come on, Harvard. Education comes from the Latin word of? Who said it? You said it. To lead out. Educare or educare, however you pronounce it. The French made this distinction between education, which has the civic dimension and the civic responsibility, and instruction, which is the teaching and the development of skills. Both are important, to be sure, in a 21st century global economy. We need to learn literacy and numeracy. We need to have a standards-based education. We need all those things which are important so that we can be competitive in a world, okay, which is challenging and scary at times. We need computer literacy. We need, high levels of understanding of science and mathematics, all those things. But we also need people who understand more than the Heisenberg principle, but understand what it means to stand toward the other, to be open to the other, and to recognize that my identity is shaped in relationality and that only emerge if there is trust, and not just transactional trust, as George Soros would have us embrace, but relational trust. The kind of trust that is necessary for collegiality, for colleagues, for what the Greeks call philia, that kind of friendship that's required for any kind of public engagement to create the world. To create that in-between that Hannah Arendt talks about so eloquently in her book Men in Dark Times, okay? Which was embodied in the work of Lessing, whose motto was to be every man's friend and no man's brother. Being a friendship for him meaning this philia which comes out of contestation and deliberation and arguing. Now, what has that got to do with public education? Everything. Because what's missing in a school reform strategy, unfortunately, is the creation of that kind of collegiality, that kind of reciprocity, that kind of relational trust between teachers, among parents and teachers, between principals and teachers and parents and classified workers, between all of the above and people who are very, very important in the lives of children, grandparents, aunts and uncles, compadres, okay, friends, neighbors, all these people that make up part of the community. And if we don't get all these people involved and recognizing that those children are not somebody else's kids, but they belong to them, then we're truly lost. And we've lost our way. That's what organizing has got to be all about. How do we create that kind of community of people who are learners and colleagues and friends in the sense of the Greek understanding of the concept of philia, and that means that they can engage in deliberations and argue in contestation with one another and learn from each other. Some folks have heard me talk about that the school has got to be the center of learning. Robert Cordova is a principal in Los Angeles at Harmony Elementary School. I like Robert because he went from being a guy who was cynical, bitter, resentful, called upon us because he wanted us to get rid of all the pesky parents who were bothering him in his life, okay? Those are his words, not mine. But Robert is now a colleague among other principals. He's an organizer of other principals. Because hopefully he's beginning to see that his job as the principal is not to be the manager and the administrator, but that his job is to be the head learner. His job is to exemplify what it means for adults to learn. Adults learning by reflection, because that's how we all learn, through reflection. Reflection on our experience and our stories. And his job is to figure out how do in order for that to occur, he can't work with other adults in that whole learning process unless they trust him. They're not going to trust him unless they understand that he cares about them as colleagues and as people. So hopefully, and hopefully you'll hear this from him tomorrow, he's learned that he's got to create a team of colleagues, of other adult learners who are thinking together, conspiring together, breathing together, arguing with each other, deliberating, negotiating with each other, and trying to figure out together how we make a difference and how do we transform harmony. But also recognize that our responsibility and our obligation doesn't end when they leave harmony, because we got to worry about what happens to those kids in middle school and high school, and hopefully until they've launched their adult lives. My theory is, if most of our kids will do well, if we can get them to the age of 24, 25, without going to jail, without getting killed, without getting hooked on drugs, without getting pregnant, okay? If that can happen, okay? I'm sorry? Pardon? Go ahead.
I said I have higher expectations for my community than that.
Well, I'm not arguing with you, but the point is I see far too many kids.
Y yo también.
Okay. Okay. ¿Quieres platicar después? Okay. ¿Podemos empezar un pleito? Okay. All right, never mind.
Pregnant or doing drugs right.
If you let me finish, I'll make my point. But if you want to come up here and make my point for me, I'll be more than happy to let you come up here, and you can take the microphone away from me, okay? You want to come up? Okay, thank you. The point I'm trying to make is that yes, I have higher expectations. Yes, I want a high standards education. I would like all of our children to speak 3 and 4 languages, no Shakespeare, no calculus, understand scientific method, okay? But unfortunately, because of good intentions, we've developed a testing regime which is driving out the capacity of most of our teachers to learn how to teach, most of our teachers to learn how to learn, most of our kids to learn how to appreciate the joy of learning. My daughter tells me, she likes a lot of the standards as a principal. She likes giving good tests, but she also notices that very few of her children want to read. There's no joy in reading. There's no joy in inquiry. There's no joy in becoming a lifelong learner. And that bothers me. It also bothers me very significantly when our kids are learning how to take tests and decode, but are not capable of reading to learn, and more importantly, don't understand how to construct an argument. There's a fellow by the name of Graff who wrote a book called Clueless in Academia, which I would recommend to most of you. And the book suggests that the difficulty is that very few kids are learning what an argument is. And they're like the character in the Monty Python skit who goes into a building looking for an argument, and he goes into this guy, and the guy contradicts him. He says, I'm looking for an argument. Well, that's down the hall, okay? That's the argument room. So he goes into the next room, and the guy immediately starts to attack him. He says, wait a minute. I'm looking for an argument. Oh, you came to the wrong room, okay? And the difficulty for most of us, we don't know the difference between an argument, which is constructing a hypothesis, evaluating that hypothesis on the basis of evidence, evaluating the relevance of the evidence, okay, and understanding and then being able to engage in other people, okay, in an argument about about the elegance or the relevance or the validity of that hypothesis based upon the evidence, okay? And that we can't do that very well, but that argument culture, if I understand the book correctly, and maybe I don't, cuts across history, mathematics, science, literature, philosophy, theology, every single academic discipline. And his point is that kids who understand how to participate in that argument culture will do well, and kids who don't will not, regardless of what the test scores are. Now, if you can show me how we are teaching teachers how to cultivate and develop the capacity of kids to participate in that kind of argument culture, how we're enabling them to be able to whether it's reading The Merchant of Venice and understanding that notwithstanding the fact that it's an anti-Semitic play, written in an anti-Semitic time, has one of the most profound depictions of people who are Jewish, and notwithstanding the fact that Shakespeare never saw a Jew in his life because they were all driven out of Great Britain at the time. And in the play Thomas More, he depicts what it's like to have to pack your bags, all of your belongings and your kids on your back. And where does he get that kind of imagination? Where does he get that kind of understanding? And how do we develop an appreciation for that? In Shakespeare, in Melville, or in Twain, or in Jane Addams, or Toni Morrison, or whomever your particular author is, whether it's Sunday Notice or whomever. And how do kids then begin to understand, as my son began to understand, that when he read the Iliad and heard about the wrath of Achilles, it was really about his father. And then when my daughter read The Portrait of Bernard as a young man, and she read that book and asked why does she have to read that book about this dead white European male, named Joyce, and I said, Mahita, because it's about you. Because Joyce is talking about his own struggle with his Catholicism, his Irish nationality, the tensions between English and Spanish, and that's your problem too, and his family. Because you've got a big Mexican Catholic family, which is very intrusive. You've got to deal with Catholicism, and you've got to deal with all those same tensions. But that wasn't what she learned in school, unfortunately. That's not why she read The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And that's not why our kids read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Melville or Twain or Toni Morrison or whoever they read. And they're not learning how to understand that those stories are about their families and their grandparents and their grandchildren, and that they got to be able to connect those stories, those classics, to their own experiences and draw out of that the capacity to connect those to movies, to plays, but more importantly to their own lives, to their own narrative, and so that they can see that they have an obligation to develop a narrative. And that's what I want for all of our children. But in order for that to happen, they got to survive. They got to get past the gang culture of South Los Angeles or East LA. They got to get past the drug culture that infests our community, and that's going to require the organization of significant power. Our strategy is how do we build the kind of power, relational power, which will enable a powerful constituency of parents and teachers, school associations, to begin to do something about school reform. And we're trying to do that in Los Angeles with UTLA, with schools. But it also involves how do you change the culture of schools from one which is top-down bureaucratic to one which is much more relational, to cultivate the capacity for people to be reciprocal. And finally, how do we begin to reweave that social fabric? We can't go back to the 1950s when I grew up. But we can take the fragments of congregations, of schools, of families, and other neighborhood bodies and begin to connect them into a broad-based organization which has an understanding of power and understands that our challenge and our tension is to get people to organize, yes, around their own interests, but understand the word interest comes from the Latin word interesse, which means to be among or between, to be connected to, so they begin to see that I can't be concerned about the safety of Jacob Josue Cortez without also be concerned about the safety of his friends and his fellow students, be it in Austin or San Antonio or Tucson. And that my interest is tied to your interest and your interest is tied to mine, and just as my identity is shaped by my relationality with you. Many years ago, Alfred North Whitehead wrote an essay called The Aims of Education, which nobody reads anymore except people like me, cranky people like me. And Whitehead warned us about the dangers of inert ideas, ideas that cannot be thrown into fresh combinations, but he also said that the most important thing about education is to teach people the obligations, the duty, the virtues of public life, so that we begin to understand that an appreciation for tradition is vital to creating this kind of moral universe, tradition being the living ideas of the dead versus traditionalism, the dead ideas of the living. Too many of our children are forced are bombarded with the dead ideas of the living rather than developing a profound appreciation, of the living ideas of the dead, which is what we mean, by this concept called the narrative, of American democracy. the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, as Lincoln read the Declaration of Independence into the Constitution of the United States in his second inaugural address. Thank you very much. I appreciate it went over time, and I hope there's some questions and some reactions to this.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jeannie Oakes. Jeannie is Presidential Professor in Educational Equity at UCLA. She's well known for her work on tracking and is the author of 17 books and over 100 research reports and articles. Her work is long focused on issues of equity and racial and social justice in education. She founded Center X at UCLA, which is focused on teacher education and professional development. And she's also director of the UC Systems All-Campus Consortium on Research for Diversity. What brings Jeannie here tonight is the work she and her colleagues have been doing for a number of years now in and around the Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, which Jeannie directs. I first learned of the IDEA Center a few years ago, and I was fortunate enough to give a talk there actually about IAF organizing. We've kept in touch and have found some avenues to connect, many avenues to connect since then. Through the IDEA Center, Jeannie's built, I think, one of the most impressive and extensive efforts to connect scholars with the work of activists. IDEA Center brings faculty, researchers, students, educators, community organizers, parent leaders, youth activists, and young people together to find ways to collaborate. Jeannie understands, I think, that communities and the adults and children in them should not just be the objects of our academic research, but have much to contribute on their own to our understanding. If we can find ways to build relationships based on respect and common interest, we can all be stimulated and learn from this kind of diversity. Jeannie and her colleague John Rogers, who will be here later tonight, I think, and for the conference tomorrow, have just written a book about their work called Learning Power, Organizing for Education and Justice. And I think Jeannie will be sharing some of the thinking from that book with us tonight. So let's welcome Jeannie Oakes.
And that actually is the cover of the book, which will be out in April. And the image is the mural on the outside wall of a little community organization in East Los Angeles called Inner City Struggle. And Luis Sanchez and Maria Brenes run that organization. And Maria will be here for the conference as well. And part of what I'm going to do tonight is tell you a little bit of her story. The book... Basically, let me just give you the argument in the book, and then I will tell you some stories about it. I mean, essentially, John Rogers and I have been academics, social scientists, committed to social justice personally, and determined to use our skills in social science research to make research an important force for advancing the values that we believe so strongly in. That's a rather unusual position, I think, for academics, but one that we have found to be extraordinarily satisfying, partly because it's led us to connect with people like Ernesto Cortez and Mark Warren and others who are quite amazing, and it's been a real privilege to study. So the book basically makes this argument, is that, and this comes out of my past of many years of trying to understand through research how schools can become more equitable, and especially around issues of racial justice, that for all of our trying, equity reform rarely takes hold, and if it does take hold, it's generally very quickly corrupted into something that's not equitable at all. That it relies on an inadequate set of assumptions and strategies. So the tools we have to try to create equity simply are insufficient. And that equity reform in the end requires cultural and political shifts every bit as much as sort of technical, practical changes in the structure and practices of schools. And so John and I have come to the view, after the last 5 or 6 years of a lot of study, that organizing of the type that Ernesto talks about may actually do better in this very pragmatic sense of creating schools that are decent and equitable for all children. And in fact, the time might be right now for an education justice movement fueled by the increase in organizing that we see everywhere. So that's the story. I want to start with this map. This is Los Angeles County. Every dot on this map is a high school, a senior high school, comprehensive senior high school that has as its mission preparing young people for all of the full range of post-secondary opportunities. The background of the map tells you about the racial composition of Los Angeles, which in fact is one of the most segregated cities in the country. The darker the coloration on the base map, the greater the population density of African American and Latinos. The lighter the base map is the absence of African American and Latinos in those neighborhoods. We identified 3 what we think are rock bottom opportunities to learn. I mean, these are the basics that I think everyone agrees no child should have to go to school without these things. One is that they are taught by a teacher who has been prepared to teach them and has been certified by the state as minimally competent, at least, to teach children. The second is that they go to a school that is not so overcrowded that it has been named by the state. The state has a category of schools called critically overcrowded schools. Those schools have exactly twice the density that is the state standard for schools. So if you're a critically overcrowded school, you're not only crowded, you've got twice as many kids as your facility was built for. And many of these schools operate on a year-round schedule where each child has 17 fewer days than a child is supposed to have in a school year, but that's how they have to cut the schedule to keep 3 tracks of kids revolving through the school so there's never an empty seat at any time during the year. And if the kids didn't drop out, and if they didn't stay away from school for all the reasons they do, there would simply not be room to hold them. So that's problem number 2, crowding. The third problem is that the school doesn't offer enough courses. So if every student there had an aspiration to attend any public 4-year college in the state, they couldn't get the classes to do it. So it's basically a curriculum problem, a teacher problem, and a facilities problem. The schools with blue dots have none of those problems. The schools with small red dots, the tiniest red dots, have 1. With the medium red dots, they have 2. And with the large red dots, those schools have all 3 problems. If you think this is a random distribution of red and blue dots, take statistics 1 again. This is after 50 years of desegregation orders, fiscal equity lawsuits in California, multicultural education, bilingual education, culturally responsive teacher education, any number of reforms, and this map is still what we live with. Now, this is an article from the Los Angeles Times, because I want to begin with the story about some people in Los Angeles who looked at that map and believe what Ernesto says about what public schools should be and decided they should do something about it. And this article appeared in the LA Times in 2003 when at Roosevelt High School, one of the biggest high schools, 5,000 students, it was not built for 5,000 students, but that's how many students go there, had a new principal. And when she showed up on the job, she was confronted by a group of young people who said they belonged to an organization called Inner City Struggle. And they spoke to her passionately about wanting to improve education for the students at that school. They asked for such complicated things as making information available on what classes students need to take to go to college. They wanted counselors who could help them make decisions about what classes to take. And they wanted to have some classes emphasizing the history of Latinos, since just about 99% of the students at Roosevelt are Latinos. They had organized this Education Justice Week where they shared their commitments with their colleagues. And what was so interesting is that the principal, when she met them, and I think this is not unusual, she was put off. And she said to the LA Times reporter, "I was really uneasy about it. That whole activism thing, you know, that can work in reverse sometimes." Okay? Remember, these kids wanted counselors, college prep courses, Latino history. This is not sort of radical, we want a marijuana corner in the near the football field, right? The group's advisor, Javier Cid, was also a history teacher at the school, said about the group, which meets 2 or 3 times a week. There are now about 300 members in East LA of young people who belong to this. He said, this is more than a club, even though they're certified as a club on campus. It's a movement. It's an awakening. And I think he's exactly right. This is Maria Brenes, who some of you will meet this weekend. Maria Brenes is a lead organizer at Inner City Struggle, and she knows something about the relationship between learning and power. And I don't believe Maria or most of the people we've met over the last 5 years would separate the two. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley and has a master's degree from Harvard. So she's an alumni of the school. But she, as a young woman, was barred from her school, her high school, on the American side of the California-Mexico border. It took a grassroots campaign and a lawsuit to secure her admission to the California high school. This incident politicized her, and it gave her a new understanding about the role of activism for social and educational change. And what she learned from that experience made her determined to help develop the leadership capacities of young people, that they learn the necessary practical and conceptual skills they need to organize and to have power for change. So under Maria's tutelage, this quite large group now is at 3 or 4 of the East Los Angeles high schools. And these young people are learning power in a way more carefully crafted than how Maria had to learn it the hard way. First of all, they are learning about power. And we have sort of 3 meanings of learning power in the book. And one of them is learning about power. And that means that they are explicitly learning about where and with whom the power over their education and their future resides. In their meetings on campus and in the Inner City Struggle office, they often construct power maps, and maybe many of you have seen power maps that look like this. They are constructing knowledge about who has power over what, how they relate to each other, and how they might build relationships, who they know that knows some of these power brokers. They also study what issues are people in power interested in, what are their positions, what do they care about, trying to understand the distribution of power, and they put them on a continuum. How likely is a person to say yes or to no to a thing that they're interested in? How might they develop their relationships with powerful people in order to try to influence them? This power map happens to be about the group's desire to have college preparation courses for all students. And they've got the school board on here, several key administrators, they've got flashpoints of things in the environment that are likely to interfere with their goal of securing more college prep classes. But they are also discovering the power of learning, and that's the second meaning of learning power. That they not only are learning about power, they use participatory research in order to develop knowledge about their own situation, their colleagues, what they care about. For example, in the spring of 2002, the ICS students at Roosevelt took a survey of 754 of their classmates' views on school discipline policies, about culturally relevant curriculum, and their access to information about college-going requirements. And they used this information to inform their own goals about what they wanted to achieve. But they also translated this information into popular education materials that they could share with community members and with families and with other students at their schools, so they could begin to build a base of knowledge about who they were and what they want that could counter the images of them that are so common in the popular media in Los Angeles that would say the kids at Roosevelt High are not kids who spend their time worrying about whether they're going to have the right courses to go to college. That's not the image in the media. A little photo of some kids doing some research. And as a result, Nancy Meza, who's a 17-year-old, actually helped them come to this goal of saying, we not only want more college classes at our school, we want college preparation to be the default, that any child who walks in this door as a 9th grader should be put in classes that means they will have a choice, as Nancy says, that the 700 students in Los Angeles Unified School District will have the freedom to choose what they want to do after high school. This isn't about forcing everyone to go to college. This is about the freedom to choose the kind of life you want to have. They are also learning to be powerful. In the sense that they're learning how to build and demonstrate the power of collective action. They inventory the resources that are available to them. They do strategic planning to identify long and short-term goals. They establish deadlines and timelines. They select tactics that will best communicate and their power to people who can help them reach their goals. They marshal large numbers of supporters in petition drives or phone jams, and they get the story out through the media, just as this article about them was in the Los Angeles Times. That's only one of many that's been in the Los Angeles Times. And they also sometimes disrupt business as usual, using such tactics as walking out, or flooding the school district headquarters with petitions, and well, the phone jams are a great example of shutting down the whole system. But, they've also discovered how to build relationships with others. Last spring, about a year ago, they joined together with about 20 or 30 other groups in Los Angeles that were coalesce around this demand to make college preparation the default curriculum for all young people in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles is about 92% students of color, most of whom are poor. So this was a very ambitious, and some would say maybe overly idealistic reform. In fact, they were told over and over and over again that you are simply going to condemn your peers to higher rates of dropping out. They can't do it. The response from some of the most kindly people in town was, you're not being realistic. You're not being realistic. And they said, it's our decision whether to be realistic about our futures or not. So they persuaded, with a number of others, this is a whole list of groups, and you can see that the list of groups here, these are not all people who think exactly like the young people in inner city struggle think. There are other groups of young people. There are groups as established as the United Way of Los Angeles, which has taken on a particular mission with the development office run by this wonderful Latina who's committed to making connections with the communities. But this is a very diverse group of people in Los Angeles who were willing to join together under the leadership of young people who wanted this reform. Now, obviously, as in many organizations, the young people didn't stay always in the leadership role. In June, after much debate, news coverage, hand-wringing, the Board of Education voted 6-1 to make the college preparation curriculum first available to all. Second, here's the resolution. So they had about 300 people show up that day at the board meeting. So this year, starting in the fall, the college prep is to be available to all. Beginning in 2008, it will be the automatic placement for all young people. And beginning in 2012, The college prep requirements in California will also be the college, the high school graduation requirements. Now, lots of people are very nervous about this, but one of the biggest victories they achieved is that the implementation of this policy is to be done in collaboration with the community groups and the young people who fought so hard for it. Here's Maria. The gentleman with her is Fabian Nunez. He's the Speaker of the California State Assembly. In a wonderful but not atypical building of relationships with people who have some power, Fabian agreed to come and be honored at a dinner sponsored by Inner City Struggle. And during his speech, when he accepted his award for being a visionary leader of California, he said, and I quote, "Your commitment to empowering parents and students has served as a catalyst for social change and educational equity," and he pledged to continue working with them to make sure to achieve education justice in California, and agreed to support their efforts to have a healthy, meaningful, realistic implementation of this college prep policy. Now, the policy, you have to understand, it's not just the courses. It's beginning in elementary school, the kinds of additional supports kids need. It's additional teachers. It's additional time. It's got a whole wraparound set of things. And it remains to be seen whether or not the school district, in collaboration with the committee or the school district, will deliver. And frankly, this victory is just the very beginning of a struggle to try to realize an equitable, high-quality school system. This letter I got on an email, it was yesterday, right? Robert Collins is the Chief Instructional Officer of Secondary Education in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and the groups are fed up. They've been meeting with him in committee for about 8 months now, and they are angry. So they've written a letter demanding that by March 15th, he delivered to them at least the baseline data they asked for right at the very beginning of the process. Data like the data I showed you on the map. Where are the classes? Are the teachers qualified? Who's in them? What special accommodations are being made for English learners? What about special ed kids? They want basic, do the science classes have laboratories in them so they can teach lab science? Basic information is what they want. We'll see. Well, that's just one of many stories, and like all of these stories, it's an unfinished story. It's a story in the making. But why not pursue conventional reform strategies to get a victory like this and to make sure that it gets implemented well? Well, I think that many of us who've studied education reform for a very long time understand that the conventional assumptions under which we try to create policies to make schools equitable are deeply flawed. First of all, we make the assumption that inequality is at odds with the basic cultural values and essentially is sustained by ignorance. So that if we simply give people the right knowledge and skills, we'll be able to make schools decent and high quality for all children and solve the problems of equity. We also think that all this can be done by working simply inside the system, that this is essentially a professional challenge, and that changing schools is like changing other organizations. And there are massive literatures on school change that basically call on the models of organizational development and systems change and management strategies to try to do schools. And that new knowledge and technical fixes to bad rules, not enough resources, bad structures and practices are going to bring equality. Those things just turn out to be not true. In fact, strong norms of scarcity, there's not enough money to afford a good education system, we're doing the best we can, there's not enough money to go around, that we give different kids different things based on their own merit, that we and that certain kids in this culture, especially poor kids and kids of color, have such deficits, not their fault, of course, because they live in poverty, because their parents don't have the background, whatever, but that it means that the uneven distribution of high-quality schooling actually makes good sense to most people. Scarcity is about the fears that Ernesto was talking about. What will happen to my child, middle-class white parent says, if every child has all of the opportunities and resources they need? That outsiders turn out to influence schooling as much as insiders. And I think anybody who's studied a desegregation order, an effort to detract schools, an effort to implement bilingual education, knows in an instant that people outside the school are in the end the ones who decide whether a policy will be implemented or whether it'll be implemented faithfully. That politics matter as much as technical expertise, like it or not. Fortunately, organizers and people who move to an organizing strategy seem to kind of like that, rather than saying it's dirty, it's not clean. And that organizational change strategies simply don't touch the norms and the politics that keep inequity in place. Okay, so confronted with all this, where do we go? Well, as academics, we like to have some grounding in theory. Now, how might you come across something that what kind of a strategy might be more effective at moving us toward equitable and high-quality schools for all children if traditional strategies don't work? Well, the first thing, because John Rogers is a Dewey scholar, the first thing we did was look to John Dewey. And then when we realized that Dewey would only take us so far, we discovered a wonderful literature on social movements and social movement organizing. And putting the two together, you not only come up with a very robust set of ideas about how to use democratic means to achieve democratic ends, and how learning and power must be blended together with the participation of everyone in our society, the development of those arguments, the deliberation under conditions of relationships with lots of collective action potential in your pocket for when you need it. Let me just skip through some of these. Okay, so when you think about learning power and John Dewey and what social movements do, you realize that the story, or I realize that the story of Maria Brennes and the inner city struggle basically has these elements in it. It was a public process. It engaged those most affected by the problems that were being tackled, a fundamental premise of Deweyan thinking about participatory social inquiry. They constructed and used knowledge, and they had a critical stance on what makes common sense. They didn't accept the conventional explanations for the way things are and where you are in this system and why things are like they are. They challenged norms of scarcity. They challenged ideas of merit, and they challenged ideas about deficits in themselves and their communities. And instead, they assert the notion of abundance, that good education can be abundant, that it's a right, a human right, to have a high-quality education, not something you deserve because you happen to score better on a test than someone else or you happen to live in the right neighborhood, and that human beings are competent learners, every single one of them, regardless of the circumstances under which they grow up. So they create new images and new stories and new understandings about who they are, what they want, and what they deserve. And they build power and they alter politics through relationships and with collective action. We think that this is a very promising strategy to achieve the goals that well-intentioned educators have wanted to achieve for a very long time and neither had the power nor the experience nor the relationships that would allow them to do it. So are the conditions right? I actually think that, as Ernesto said, there's been this incredible upsurge in organizing for education reform. And all over the country, grassroots groups who basically devoted their energies to other topics, housing, jobs, healthcare, are now looking to education as the foundation. We also have a set of social conditions now that are very hospitable to social movements, and I think much of what Ernesto said spoke to that. We're in a situation today where the inadequacy and the inequality is increasingly large and is visible. I mean, we are in a time of growing disparities, and very visible ones, in the streets of our cities all over this country. And we're also at the same time in a time when we have this contradiction between our rhetoric and that reality. So we walk around now saying no child left behind. In a situation where the disparities are growing larger and larger, that is the stuff of which social movements are made, especially at the point where the media or others begin to legitimize those concerns. Will it happen? Well, no academic would make a prediction about this. But I think that the next set of very important questions, and ones that we're beginning to engage in Los Angeles, and that I would challenge all of you to think about as well, is what does it take to go from wonderful organizing around specific goals like college prep for all? What does it take to move from that to a social movement where the public is really beginning to think and dialogue very differently around issues of scarcity? Is there enough good education to go around? About who is deserving? And confront, after decades and centuries of denying it, confront this deficit way of thinking that so dominates our public life. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Terrific. Our final contributor tonight is Karen Mapp, who offers some reflections on the presentations to help open up the discussion. I'll just be a little brief in the introduction because we have been running over a little. Karen joined us here at the School of Education last year as lecturer on education. She's been studying parent involvement and community partnerships for a long time and working with parent organizations and community organizations on this. She has been the president of the Institute for Responsive Education, which sponsors the Boston Parent Organizing Network here in Boston. And most recently, she was the interim deputy superintendent for family and community engagement for Boston Public Schools. So please join me in welcoming Karen.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to take a moment, though, to give our panelists a round of applause because I thought their comments were just remarkable and amazing. So thank you. I've always thought that this role of respondent was a little wacky because I never quite could figure out, what is a respondent really supposed to do? And so most of you who know me know that I sort of go my own way on these things. So what I've decided to do was to really listen to what they said and put together from their comments a real call to action to those in us, for those of us in this room tonight. Because to me, a respondent, it means that, I'm supposed to help you respond to them, right? To do something with what they told you tonight. Not just to summarize it in an academic way, but to take it and to use their words as a call to action. A call to action. So what I want to try to get us to think about here tonight is how we, every one of us in this room, can participate, cultivate, and propel this educational justice movement that Jeannie and Ernie talked about. And, a lot of times I talk to my students and I tell them, though I see many of them in here, I say to them, if you're going to do this work, what you're going to have to be is a warrior for social justice. And that's what I tell them. And some of them come up to me after and they say, Professor Mapp, this is kind of you're laying it on heavy here, right? What does that mean? What do you want me to do? Well, I think our speakers gave us some ideas, and I think everybody in this room can do this. So I'm going to go through a couple of steps based on what our speakers said. First of all, you start with something personal. Because when Ernie started to talk, what did he do? He told a personal story about the foundation of his work. He talked about his family. He talked about those families and those community members that surrounded him. to make him who he is today. So the first step is to start with a personal story. Something that's inside you, that's burning inside you, that caused you to come here tonight or to engage in this work or to be a student here or to be a faculty member here. Anything you do, look inside. Because you know that energy you get from those personal stories, that's what's going to help carry you through this hard work. So start with a personal story. Start with within. Number 2, follow a moral compass. Follow a moral compass. Not easy to do in 2006. You must follow a moral compass. You act out of values and principles, and particularly a principle that says you are committed to the other, to that person who is sitting next to you or behind you, not just to yourself. So you want to follow a moral compass. Another thing I always say to my students, and I actually glanced out in the audience and I saw them smiling at me when they heard that term, trust and relationships, right? So we want to work to create settings where relational trust is at the core of the work. We've forgotten about the importance of relationships. And I can tell you from my work in a district where we struggled with this piece around relationships. What normally happens in district work is that the relationship piece is seen as this touchy-feely thing that, does it really matter? Well, what I'm asking you to do is that you've got to drive the relationship priority up back to the top. It can't settle to the bottom of the barrel, because it's stitched into all the work around teaching and learning and instruction. Without that relational trust, no reform strategy is going to take hold. So we've got to move the relationship building up. I talk about operationalizing relationship building. And you heard, if I had 25 cents for every time we heard the word relationship tonight, I could probably go out and buy myself a new suit, because it was mentioned many, many times. Number 4, listen to our students and to the community. And not just listen, work collaboratively with them. When Jeannie was talking about the work of her students, I don't know how many of you attended the Alumni of Color Conference. We had a fabulous presentation by students from Brighton High School doing some of the very same work. And you know, it might be nice to get those students together with one another, right, Jessica? Maybe we can do that. It would be great for them to talk with some of the students from California who are doing this very same work.
Karen?
Yes.
I'm right here in this row.
Hooray! And they did a fabulous job. So we've got to start listening and working with them. Not just going in and writing down their words and then going off and writing our papers, okay, in our books, but really participating with members of the community and our students. And then learn power. Learn power. And Jeannie, I'm going to recommend, and if we can have that PowerPoint, to put it up on a website somewhere, because, you know, I think that that's something that we all need to do, is learn power. Not just our teenagers. I think everybody in this room needs to take a lesson in and do some of these power maps when we're trying to do things. You know, who influences decisions? When we want to get something done, who do we need to talk to? How do we need to talk to them? What do we need to know? I've been back here on Appian Way since last January. And I'm going to tell you something. It's too quiet on this street. It's too quiet on this street. I have a lot of students saying to me, well, you know, Dr. Mapp, we don't have time to do this activism thing. But I'm going to tell you something. Jen Suisse and I are working on a paper together about leadership development. And one of the things that we talked about tonight is that, you know, developing leadership isn't something that you do after hours. It's not something that's a course that you take as an elective. It's not something that gets developed as a sidebar. It is the work that you do every day. So this activism piece, it's a part of your work. It's a part of your learning. It has to be embedded in what you do if you're going to end up being a warrior for social justice. It can't be something you do only when you have time, because otherwise you're going to miss out on an extraordinary part of your learning. So those are the pieces that I think we all need to engage in to take up this call to action so that we can really be a part of this movement, this social justice movement for educational equity for all children. So I want you to do another thing tonight, and that's something else both of our presenters said a couple of times. You need to reflect. Go home and look in that mirror. Take a good long look in that mirror and decide, which piece of this can I pick up? And I challenge all of us to do that tonight as a result of what we've heard. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was terrific. Okay, we still do have a few minutes for questions and discussion. Can I ask anybody who wants to ask a question to come to one of the mics to do that? You're welcome to, I guess, line up there. And maybe I could ask people to ask a question and not to make a statement, so we have a chance to get a few things out on the table. So is there anyone who has a question for one of our panelists? Sure. Could you go to the mic, and anyone else who wants to step up to the other mic could do that too.
Hi, my name is Mariska Nunez, and I'm a student here in the Education Policy Management Program. And a quick note, my father is a graduate, or was a graduate of Roosevelt High School, and I graduated from the Teach LA program at Center X at UCLA. So my question is, I've read that Superintendent Roy Romer is probably going to retire in the fall, and I was wondering what role can community action groups such as the ones that you've mentioned today, what role can they play in influencing how the new superintendent will be chosen? Should I ask again?
Response to that?
Well, there's going to be, if you do a power analysis of Los Angeles, you'll realize that there's a lot of people who are going to be very important in that decision. 7 years ago, how long has Romer been there?
About that.
7 years
9
ago,
maybe.
before Roy Romer became superintendent, a friend of mine called me. I was at an SEIU national convention speaking to them. A friend of mine called me. I'm not going to tell you his name, but I think you'll probably guess who I'm talking about, and said that he had the votes lined up to unanimously name him the superintendent of education. And I asked him, how was that possible? He said, well, I just met with Eli Broad, okay? And if you don't know who Eli Broad is, he's one of the founders of Kaufman and Broad, and he's a pretty influential guy in Los Angeles. He's got lots and lots of money, okay? And he was very close at that time to the mayor, who at that time was Richard Riordan. And they've got the votes lined up, okay, because Richard Riordan at that time had put together an organization which had financed the election of a woman named Caprice Young, who's then the chairman of the Board of Education, and so that they had the votes to name him superintendent. And I said, well, and he asked me, should I take the job? And I said, don't take the job unless you're willing to work for 10 years, knowing full well that you will not get credit for the most important things that you do. Because the most important things you do will begin to change the whole culture of that school district, okay? The most important things you do are going to be things which create the capacity of that school district to do exactly what we all want them to be able to do, which is to deliver okay, a college preparatory education, a high standards education for all kids, okay? But that presumes certain things take place, you know, at preschool, elementary school. It presumes certain kinds of things go on with parents. It presumes that we have the teachers to teach. We have the mentors to teach the teachers how to teach. That we have the principals to be leaders, educational leaders, okay? He didn't take the job. He said no, okay? Even though he was, you know, quite talented, quite charismatic. Now, the other piece of advice I said to him, don't go in there unless you're also going to go in there with a team of people, particularly somebody who's going to ride shotgun for you the whole time, okay? Because the other problem you have with that school district is you got every people. It's nothing is as it seems. Okay, people will say yes, they will say yes. Okay, and then they'll do everything they can, and they'll be enthusiastic about yes, and then they'll sabotage, you know, the very thing that you're asking them to do. Okay, and it'll be like, you know, Harry Truman saying to Dwight Eisenhower, "Poor Ike, you know, he'll think that being president is like being in the army, where you tell somebody to do and they say how to jump, and they say how high." When you be president, you ask somebody to do something 25 times, and it's after, you know, the 30th time that they say yes. So my point I'm trying to make is you got to know, because if you're going to change the culture of LA Unified, you not only have to make sure that the school board and the mayor understands what you got to do, but you got to make sure you have you understand who are going to be the adversaries to a reform agenda and who's going to be allies, and who are going to be the people who are neutral, and how do we make people who are adversarial, either neutralize them, etc. And that means, again, doing the kind of careful power analysis, but also building the alliances with the people who matter. And those people who matter are people who also have power, okay? And that means understanding that we got to figure out how do we work with the teachers' organizations, how do we work with the parents, okay, groups, how do we work with congregations, how do we work with business leaders, how do we work with political leaders, how do we make sure that the LA Times gives you the time to implement a school reform agenda, because all they got to do is to start to vilify, you know, and demand to know why haven't things changed yesterday, okay, that they can create, okay, the capacity for any reform agenda to not to take place, and they'll then say that the only hope for LA for kids is charters or vouchers or bust up the school district or have the mayor take it over. And maybe the mayor ought to take it over, okay, I don't think so. But then that's going to be a big fight with these teacher organizations, etc. Now, I'm not trying to make this thing complicated, okay? But I'm going to say to you is that if you want to do something about school reform, you got to be meaner than a junkyard dog. In fact, you got to be a junkyard dog, okay? Because that's what's going to take people who've got the kind of anger which gives them patience and tenacity and energy to kind of, and a sense of humor to kind of balance that anger so they can stay at it. Okay. And I apologize if I went too long.
Okay. Great. All right. Why don't we take, I think we have to come to the mic also.
I'm actually impaired, and it's hard for me to get
Okay.
out, so I'm wondering if I could ask my question from. Can we get the mic to her?
Sure. Why don't we do that?
I didn't know there was someone standing there. No, I'm gonna give,
What?
no, so you can be
Why
recorded.
don't, you know what, I think maybe we'll take a couple of questions and then let the panelists respond to a couple of questions.
Okay, I
'Cause
actually
there's
have a couple of questions.
Well, you get to have one, and then
Ernie,
come back in.
I've been described as a pit bull for community organizing around education in Boston. So I appreciate your last comment, because I thought I needed to be nicer in order to be effective. But I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between community organizing and mobilizing. And then, Jeannie, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the political will necessary among white people in America, United States, to build a social justice movement that includes brown and black people having the same access to education that their white privilege has, in fact, disprivileged people of color.
Okay.
The political will for a social justice movement.
Great. Yeah, we'll take two more questions and then let the panelists respond. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I have a question for Ms. Oakes, and then I have a question for Mr. Cortez. You were talking about building a platform for social movements, and although public education parity issues are quite important, I'm wondering how you might respond to the question that we need to sort of, if you want to look at sort of activists and social justice organizers, that there are a range of different corollary issues that we need to speak about: economic justice, education parity. And I'm wondering if the tent could be large enough that those who are social justice seekers could really think about how we could touch upon all of those things at the same time. And the question for Mr. Cortez is that a person who has done faith-based organizing and leaving to work with Jobs with Justice to lead the faith-based effort, there are many concerns that the faith-based community has, and clearly capacity building is one of them. If they decide that the issue, because cutting the issue, first they have to decide what issue they're going to focus on. There's several different issues that are affecting disparate communities, communities of color, poor communities. How might we think about capacity building to look at a broader social justice agenda? Because in fact our communities are under peril, and it's not just a public education parity issue, it comes down to economic justice. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that, because IEF clearly speaks to that. So.
Okay, great, thank you. One more question.
Hi, I'm a student with the Education Policy and Management Program, and I was also a teacher in LA Unified, so I'm very excited about the reforms that are happening there now. And I was wondering, what kind of strategies do we need to implement in the district and in schools in order for what has happened with the organizations and the students struggling for social change to kind of take hold and grow and continue to have this sort of sustainability despite what might happen with the community organizations? And secondly, I would like to know what is currently the stance of the Teachers Union in LA regarding these reforms, and what do you feel the role of the Teachers Union should be?
Okay, great. Why don't we let Jeannie, do you want to go? And then Ernie, and I think these will be our last comments. Sure. And Karen, if you want to. Yeah. Okay, great. Jeannie, thanks.
So I think the first question was about building a social movement that white people would join, right? I personally think we have one, right? From my own experience. I mean, I think that the values and the commitments that are echoing through this organizing for justice are ones that are deeply shared by most Americans when they are not completely constrained by the fear and anxiety that there isn't enough to go around, and that any generosity that they may extend, because many white people feel that justice is about generosity, will in fact endanger their own status. So I think I've been reading the social movement literature a lot, trying to answer this question about how do you build movements that bring together people across race, across class, and across issues, right? And I think that, I'm not sure about tactics to do that. I'm much more persuaded by the notion of shared values and looking to our own traditions and our commitments and the rhetoric we love to talk about as being part of our culture, but so rarely act on because of the real and perceived constraints in the structures that we currently have. I think that, one of the things I think is very interesting and that could be managed or thought about at least is where is the line between privilege and lack of privilege? We have a funny place where we draw it now, and most people who suffer from the disparities and the inequalities in our society tend to think of themselves as privileged. Most white people think of themselves as privileged. It absolutely is not borne out by the facts. Not borne out by the facts. But it's incumbent on those who would create a broad movement to begin to frame the issues and the circumstances as such so that line begins to be drawn somewhere else. So I think this is a very hard question. I don't feel at all adequate to answer it, but I think it is a very important question. I think we can look to women's movements, although women's movements have not been very successful in doing this. I think some of the problems the women's movement are having now is because the framing of the movement was dominated by one social class, in this case mostly middle-class white women, and now the issues that are on the line are not about general issues for poor women and women of color either. So, there's much to be learned. The second thing is, I do think the tent is large enough to include other issues. And in fact, I don't think community organizing can proceed unless other issues are part of it, because while social scientists and policy advocates, or wonks, may see things as separate sectors, the people who live the lives don't have these boundaries between what is housing, what is health care, what is transportation, what is job, what is education. And one of the most, I think, constructive elements of an organizing movement is the blurring of these silly boundaries we have around social programs. And then I think the last thing for me was the sustainability without what happens when the organizations go away. I think that's the wrong question. I think the question is how do we make community-based organizations such a robust part of the fabric of society that it would be inconceivable to think of public schooling operating without this very strong partnership and relationships with community groups. And the teachers union in LA, we are so lucky. We've just elected a progressive group of mostly young people who are determined to develop a reform agenda that begins to cast off the sort of image that's mostly, I think, placed on the union by others, but in fact they bear some responsibility too, as being simply bread and butter, simply self-serving. And I know that one of their new best friends is Ernesto.
Okay, great, thanks.
Let's see how this is. I'm going to try to do this in 3 minutes when I could do this in 3 hours. Okay, but I won't. I promise, except after dinner. One of the problems we have in public education, and I tried to articulate this earlier and didn't do a good job, was that we don't have a real understanding of the word public. There is no public right now for public education. We view it all as individualized, as thinking about, and part of the reason why we do that is because the reform strategies have been so driven by technicians and policy wonks that people are thinking about, well, how does this affect my kid, okay, and maybe my career, and sometimes my school, but very rarely do we think about it as in terms of how do we construct a relationship among people who care deeply about what's happening. It's really what happens to my kid. So my daughter had Robert Cordova's attitude, okay? How do I keep all these pesky parents away from me? Because when she started out as a teacher, parent involvement meant, you coming to her and asking her for extra help for her kid. Or you coming to her and asking her, you generically, okay, to give her kid another break. Or you asking her, okay, to give her a higher grade than she actually deserved because she needed to pass the course or take cheerleading or whatever it was, because we had this policy which some kids thought was silly, was you couldn't be a cheerleader, you couldn't play football unless if you were flunking courses, okay, in academic courses. So a lot of that, so there was this kind of attitude that what parental involvement was, and of course I remember once talking to Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby, because I was telling him about our strategy for forming alliance schools, and he said, well, parental involvement can be a number of things, because there was just this big story of this woman who had the competition for her daughter's cheerleading position assassinated, okay, because she wanted her daughter to get, the top spot. And she said, that's parent involvement, isn't it? Okay, is that what you're talking about? No. So we had to really be clear that that's not what we're talking about. So what we're talking about is how do we create, okay, this understanding that there has to be this, we're in this same boat together, we're in this kind of common struggle for justice, not just for my kid, but for all of our kids. Now that's hard to do in a culture which teaches individualism. That's hard to do in a culture which says that we ought to do what we think is right, and that we don't have to, take into consideration other people's agenda and other people's perspective, much less other people's narratives and stories. And so therefore we don't really have a lot of practice at being attentive, a lot of practice at listening, a lot of practice at being curious, a lot of practice at being imaginative. So one of the first things we try to teach people that organizing is all about is how to do a relational one-on-one meeting. And do that one-on-one meeting in such a way that you draw out that person's story, that person's fears, anxieties, that person's history, and their ambitions. Okay, and that means and if they got if they're half a brain, they're not going to tell you that right away. Okay, unless they're just bored stiff and on an airplane. Okay, but they'll tell you that after they begin to trust you. And so that means that there has to be a commitment to building a relationship over time, which of course is hard to do in a culture which demands immediate gratification. All right. So part of what we got to figure out is how do we teach people this virtue of delayed gratification? How do we inculcate in people? And unfortunately, as Richard Sennett has pointed out, that's hard to do without some kind of institution. A learning organization, be it the workplace, be it a union, be it a school. And so therefore I agree totally with Jeannie, we can't sustain any kind of reform strategy without recognizing that it has to be institutional in nature. To be sure, institutions need renewal. They need agitation. They need stirring up. Our mantra is all organizing is disorganizing and reorganizing. Now that's not going to happen without two things. One is talented organizers. And if you want to do something seriously and significant, decide today that you're going to either make a decision to become a career organizer, or if you're not any good at it, find somebody else who's good at it, okay? And help us figure out how do we get the resources to mentor and develop that person as a serious organizer. Now don't send us anybody, okay, who's looking for a job. Send us somebody who's looking for a vocation. Send us somebody who's got some imagination and some curiosity and a lot of anger. Synthesized with humor, because the worst thing in the world are revolutionaries, okay, who take themselves too seriously. Okay? Number one is they're dangerous, and number two is they're boring. Okay? So we got to find people who've got a sense of humor, who can synthesize anger and humor, who understand their own mortality, understand that the world doesn't depend upon them, okay? And so that they have the kind of qualities that we need. Otherwise, and the second thing you got to have are leaders who are like organizers, who are talented and who are relational. Why is that so important? Well, I'll tell you a story. My son is an organizer for the Service Employees International Union. One of the things he did, which was kind of risky, was to organize a union of organizers, okay? And so he put that together, okay, and then I said, son, be careful, okay, not because you're going to get fired, that's not a problem, okay, because you might get what you ask for. And they won, they were succeeded, they got the staff union. Then he calls me up and says, Dad, you're right, okay, because he organized the staff union because he wanted training and mentoring and professional development, okay. But if he doesn't go to the meetings, they don't ask for training and development, professional development. They ask for time off. They ask for breaks. They ask for more money, more expenses, etc. All of which are legitimate. But what happened to the reform agenda? Okay, what happened to the larger vision about being good organizers? What happened about building relationship with the rest of the community so that they understand why we're doing this kind of work? That goes out the window without himself and his roommate if they don't go to the meeting or get some of their people that they know who have this vision. So there is a role, believe it or not, in an egalitarian school like Harvard for leaders, okay, and potential leaders. Now, not leaders who come out of privilege in the sense of economic privilege, but leaders who've got natural talent, and that's what organizing is all about, finding those talented leaders who are smart, not necessarily educated. Some of them didn't go to Harvard, okay? You don't need to go to Harvard to be a good leader, okay? But who've got that kind of judgment and common sense that is so sorely lacking in some of the graduates of Harvard and Yale who occupy very powerful positions, and I don't want to get partisan again, so I won't mention where they are, okay? So we got to remember that, okay? So we're looking for those kind of natural leaders who kind of have this natural inclination to be relational, and you know that because when you begin to meet with them, you meet with a guy like Marcos Munoz, okay? He's got networks. He can deliver, and you test them out. You test them out in small actions. You test them out in research actions, like Jeannie pointed out. But you begin to see that after they get an appetite for this kind of stuff. And you cultivate them and then connect them to other leaders and potential leaders. And after a while, you got a network of people who are connected to institutions and who are beginning to understand that there's some real power in institutions. Why are institutions so important to this strategy? I'll tell you why. If you read the history of the civil rights movement, the magnificent work that people like Ella Baker and Robert Moses and Fannie Lou Hamer and all those people, okay, you also know that they believed in the beloved community. They were exactly where we were. But what happened?
No covenant.
There was no covenant, there was no institutional base, there was no network. The media went to the charismatic leaders, the big action. They got resentful because other people were getting the recognition that they deserved, and they didn't have a way to sustain, okay, the struggle and the narrative to renew it institutionally. They didn't have the kind of ongoing network of organizers, okay? And talk to Bob Moses about how to do that, okay? And he's trying to do that with us in the Algebra Project. And he's trying to recreate those, help create that kind of vision of that moral commonwealth, but it has to be realistically connected to institutions. Finally, it's got to understand the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Okay, I'm an old fogey. I believe in original sin. I think we have the capacity to be just. We have the capacity to be relational. But unfortunately, as Reinhold Niebuhr taught us, we also have the inclination to be self-centered and selfish. I worry when I talk to a friend of mine who says, you know, that the muckety-mucks of this world are so concerned about China and India that they think they got to do something now about public education. But what they want to do is not what you want to do. What they want to do is find those elite that they can make scientists and mathematicians overnight, get them away from everybody else, cultivate them and develop them so that we have the capacity to compete. And then they want everybody else to be subjected to a low-wage strategy, okay, where we're economic serfs, as Bob Moses talks about. And that's not going to happen if we don't begin to develop a broad-based institutional strategy, which, yes, deals with housing, yes, deals with understanding of education, but its connection to the whole questions of technology and jobs and the market, and we understand that there has to be a public sector. If we privatize everything, then we don't understand how the role that the public sector plays in creating markets, in creating institutions. If we get into this low-wage strategy, we don't understand the distinction between a low-wage strategy and a strategy which is about low labor unit cost. Low labor unit cost means you've got productive workers who are productive because they're loyal, they care, and they know that they're going to get taken care of they're going to get the rewards that they so justly deserve. A low labor unit cost strategy requires institutions which are innovative and are learning institutions. Learning doesn't take place, innovation doesn't take place without collegiality, without trust, without reciprocity. Our schools are going to reflect our enterprise culture. We know that. They look like the businesses. And we got to recognize that part of our strategy is recognizing that. And if we let the employers get away, the muckety-mucks get away with a low-wage strategy, our schools are going to reflect that low-wage strategy, and they're going to find the people who are the kind of the talented tenth, okay, to invest in, and the rest of us are going to be subjected, okay, to the leftovers, and it ain't going to be much left over, okay? So my suggestion to all of you is think hard. Find some talented organizers. Find some talented leaders. Find some resources so that we can train and mentor those, make these broad-based organizations the kind of innovative learning organizations, okay, which have the capacity to act and learn from action and reflection and begin to develop a moral compass and a moral center that we're all talking about, okay, and learn the real story of these traditions that we're all so proud of and ought to be proud of, okay? Patriotism does not have to be the last refuge of the scoundrel. Patriotism can be something that we all is ennobling and can be proud. We all can be proud of. Okay, thank you.
All right. Great. Thank you, everyone, for hanging in there. We've gone a little bit over time, actually, but I think it was really, really interesting and important discussion. I have one announcement before I thank again our guests. Many people here who are coming to the conference tomorrow know that some of us are going to John Harvard's brew house for something to eat or a drink after this, just to confirm that that is in fact the case. And if anyone else here would like to walk over and join us over there, we'll be in the pub side of that fine establishment. So thank you very much again. I hope you can join me in thanking our guests for coming and sharing their insights with us.